Brazilian President Lula da Silva meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping today in Beijing. They are discussing the war in Ukraine and a recent agreed-upon trade deal. Lula is calling on developing countries to work toward replacing the U.S. dollar with their own currency in trade. Brazil and China struck that deal last month to ditch the dollar in transactions. Lula also touring Huawei's Innovation Center yesterday. Joining me right now is the Atlas Organization founder and author of The Decisive Decade, on bookshelves and right now. Jonathan D.T. Ward is with us. Jonathan, it's good to see you. We've been talking a lot about this dollar story. I find it very concerning. But first, let's start on Lula viewing Huawei headquarters. What do you think that means for Brazilians?
Well, Huawei in Brazil is actually a pretty big story. I use it as an example in The Decisive Decade. Huawei has very big ambitions in Brazil. I mean, it's a country where it has not been banned. So even as the U.S. has been successful in pushing Huawei out of allied countries like Britain and Australia, in Brazil, you have Huawei executives talking about their ambitions to, move through the entire value chain to help Brazil modernize its ICT infrastructure and also to provide ICT alongside other Chinese companies such as those in agricultural machinery. So Huawei really can become the backbone of a country's infrastructure and technology, and this is bad. I mean, you do not want this in Brazil. In a close, I mean, Brazil is half the size of South America almost, and has always been a partner to the United States. But to see Lula take this direction, I think it's extremely problematic and dangerous for U.S. diplomacy, and we can see that Chinese diplomacy is having a field day right now. I mean, from the brokering of a peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to having Macron show up in Beijing and undermine the entire alliance system to now having Lula call for the end of dollar-denominated trade between China and Brazil. I mean, this is what it's like as China begins to convert its economic power into diplomatic power and try to reshape the global order. So this is always going to be a global contest. I mean, that's something that I demonstrated in my first book, China's Vision of Victory. We're going to be dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, not just in the island chains or in the Indo-Pacific, but all around the planet. I mean, they have economic relations that they're turning into diplomatic heft, and that goes across the entire world.
Yeah, but I want to talk about the implications of this, because you said that Huawei would represent the backbone of the infrastructure. I would go one step further and say it will also represent the backbone of surveillance of Brazilians right now, because Huawei is one of the key tools that the CCP uses for surveillance. Isn't that true?
Well, certainly. I mean, Huawei is a known quantity. I mean, it's, backed by the Chinese state. It's involved in their human rights atrocities. I mean, it's a pretty clear story at this point. So to see it potentially succeed in Brazil would, I think, be an enormous blow to America's position in the Western Hemisphere. So I think we have to work on that. I mean, China's trade with Brazil is double ours now. I mean, their investment in Brazil is very significant. We do not have a Latin America strategy that's working, and we need one. This goes into the entire problem of U.S., sort of the lack of U.S. engagement in the emerging world. And meanwhile, I mean, we don't really talk about the Belt and Road anymore.
That's
but
right.
China's invested over $900 billion in direct investment and construction deals in the Belt and Road since 2005. So, they're pouring a total of over $2 trillion in overseas investment. And this is all part of a concerted strategy to bind these continents, including Latin America, to China. Brazil is not a member of the Belt and Road, but 7 South American countries are, including Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. So they have a very focused strategy here, and we're just not showing up. So major changes in U.S. strategy are going to have to occur here in order to compete economically, get our companies to win in major countries like Brazil. I think we're probably going to need a U.S. and allied sovereign wealth fund in order to deploy the kind of capital that our own banks can't and won't do for strategic long-term objectives. And that's the only way we're going to win this long game. I mean, we have to compete in the emerging world, and we're not doing it. And our companies can't do this alone, and our banks don't think long-term enough. So we're going to have to go on all those fronts.
It doesn't look like this administration would do something like that. It's been an incredibly soft approach to communist China, and China is moving forward and continuing the investments that you're talking about, while also pushing back on any pushback. China has now sanctioned the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Texas Congressman Michael McCaul, after he led that congressional delegation to Taiwan last week to meet with Taiwanese President Tsai. McCaul says this, quote, "Being sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party neutrality is a badge of honor, Jonathan. What are the implications of this sanction from Beijing on the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee?
Well, that's right, Maria, and that needs to be emphasized. I mean, this is the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee that's just been sanctioned by our primary adversary. And they've also sanctioned a former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo.
That's right.
I mean, this is an adversary state. It's a totally hostile regime. And again, one of the biggest issues here is business leaders in China. I mean, try to understand that they're sanctioning our senior-most officials. I mean, if you really think you won't have a long-term business relationship with that state, then you're not getting Cold War II economic edition. I mean, this is, it's time for our business leaders to look for the exit. I mean, we can't, this is a state that is hostile to the United States of America and feels that it can make moves like that, which are just a direct demonstration of hostile intent.
Yeah, it's incredible to see those CEOs continue to, dig deeper into the Chinese market. They want to sell to 1.4 billion people, but they're not recognizing the national security issues that you raise so much. Batya is with me this morning. Go ahead, Batya, jump in.
Good morning. Batya Ungar-Sargon from Newsweek here. So I couldn't agree more with what you've said, but I wonder if there's a sort of silver lining here in terms of U.S. economic decoupling from China. And I'm wondering what you make of the argument made by Michael Pettis and Matthew Klein in their book, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, where they actually argue that the dollar is too strong vis-a-vis China, which leads to all of Chinese investments coming here and ends up weakening American workers in relation to Chinese workers to a degree that actually ends up hurting our economy. So is there a kind of silver lining that could be found here in terms of our potential decoupling from China on the economic domestic front?
Well, look, I think there are going to be a lot of silver linings to decoupling. I mean, you have to rebuild the United States. You have to get capital off of corporate balance sheets. You have to have a U.S.-focused sort of investment initiative to start rebuilding the industrial base. I mean, that's going to be essential. That will benefit American workers. We have all sorts of strategic industries that should benefit from this. And at the same time, the nature of the dollar as the reserve currency, I think, is incredibly important. I mean, we want to keep that. And that means having, there's going to be a battle for global trade. If China is able to successfully turn its trading relationships into yuan-denominated relationships, that will increase the proportion of the RMB in global trade. Still not that much. I mean, the U.S. dollar is 60% of global transactions. The RMB is about 2.5%, and they have a closed capital account. So it's not that they can really make this move all the way, but I think we will have to take it seriously when we see states like Brazil, which really matter to global trade and to international diplomacy.
Yeah.
We want Brazil on our side, and we want countries like Indonesia and Nigeria and other anchor states in major emerging regions to be more towards the U.S. side. So that's going to require consolidating the alliance system through economic and military power. I mean, we are a military alliance system that spans Europe to Asia, and the more that we deepen our trade ties and sort of push China out of the alliance system, the more leverage and I think pull we'll have with the emerging world. But we're not yet seeing a global economic strategy from the United States, and that's exactly what we need. There will be many benefits if we can start to get serious and strategic about the whole picture.
Well, I'm glad you said that. It's 60%, the dollar, versus 2% on the yuan, because Adam Johnson's here, and I just said to you, I asked you, do you worry about the dollar? I mean, as an investment guy, jump in here.
Yeah, oh, thank you. Jonathan, Adam Johnson here. Question for you. And I want to push back a little bit on the notion that the Chinese yuan could ever challenge or replace the U.S. dollar. I think that currencies are about confidence. And how could the rest of the world have confidence in a regime, China, that seems to be undermining other countries at its own benefit or in the attempts to benefit itself?
Well, look, first of all, I'm not saying the RMB is going to replace the dollar. I think I'm saying the opposite of that. I mean, 60% versus 2% is a pretty long way to go. And on the other hand, when you look at Michael Pettis' arguments, and I know him well, he's I think, a very good observer of this, running deficits, allowing us, to have that position as the destination for, foreign purchases of assets. I mean, that does benefit us. And I think if you're doing that throughout the alliance system, that's one thing. But, closing down the deficit with China is another, because you don't want them to have that surplus that they can reinvest into other things and create global influence. But, bottom line, I don't think we're going to see this happen in the near term, any kind of replacement of the dollar by the RMB. But if people were taking seriously what you've just said, that China's a regime that's undermining all sorts of things and has sort of nefarious activities, then I think the international economy would look very different. I mean, you still have CEO delegations, you still have investment going into China, you still have Lula going over there, Macron going over there. These are people that are not taking that seriously. That's the problem. They're not taking the nature of the regime seriously. If they did, then their economic power would be significantly smaller.
Yeah.
And it's all going to be driven by trade. I mean, any real advancement of the RMB is going to be driven by China's trading relationships. And that's a game where we are not doing well. I mean, you look at,
look at the
Brazil,
deficit.
China and Brazil. Well, China and Brazil trade $150 billion a year, and we trade, 75. And that is going to be true across the emerging world.
Yeah.
We're not playing a
the
game.
Republicans are now talking more about this most favored nation status that China has than trying to remove that. So we'll see if the trade situation changes and the U.S. uses that as a leverage point. I just want to point out PNC Financial has reported better than expected earnings, revenue in line. We're waiting on J.P. Morgan. As soon as we get those numbers, we're going to go right to Jerry. She's going to get those numbers to us. But while we're waiting on JPM, let me get your take on these leaked Pentagon documents reportedly revealing that China approved lethal aid for Russia for the war in Ukraine earlier this year and planned to disguise the military equipment as civilian items. The Biden administration claims that they still haven't seen the evidence that China has transferred weapons to Russia. Is it any question in your mind that China has supported Russia in its war on Ukraine?
Well, Maria, we know that Beijing is Putin's biggest backer. I mean, they've been supporting that war from the beginning. Russia-China relations have been deepening in terms of their own strategic coordination for 10 years now, since Putin seized Crimea and China built the military islands in the South China Sea almost at the same, within the same span of time. So they know exactly what they're doing. There's plenty of Chinese support. Politico has already broken the story of assault rifles and body armor coming from one of China's largest state-owned military companies. And look, the way to break that axis is to start going after the Chinese companies and banks that are consolidating the Russia-China relationship. And the Ukrainians are already making that list, by the way. They're showing us the companies that are supporting Russia's war. We just need to hit them with the targets, that we can do through economic sanctions.
Well,
we're not going after the Chinese banks yet. That's what we need to be doing.
There were enablers to, the Nazis back in the day as well. I wonder if corporate America is getting this and understanding the national security issues. You've got the Women's Tennis Association now announcing they plan to return to China this fall. They're ending a boycott that started back in 2021 over concerns about the safety of tennis star Peng Shuai. Shuai accusing a high-ranking Chinese Communist Party official of sexual assault. And ever since doing so, she has not been seen in public very much. So I guess she's another one that was disappeared, Jonathan.
Yes, I mean, eventually they're all looking for their way back into this market. I mean, it's, as you said, it's 1 billion people, and I think that's how many American business people and associations and companies look at this. But this is the nature of the contest we're going through is one where we have to restrain ourselves from selling the communists the rope with which they'll hang us. I mean, Lenin said that. He was wrong. It wasn't Russia. It's going to be China. We're in the process of doing that, and we have to stop.
Yeah.
As long as we enable the rise of China, and it was us that did it with our technology, our capital, and our markets. That's how we got the supercharging of the People's Republic of China.
Yeah.
We can still take that away, but the window is closing very fast.
All right, Jonathan, great conversation. We appreciate it. Jonathan D.T. Ward, thank you, sir. We will see you soon.